The winter of 1944 was no ordinary winter in Ukraine. It was a beast of ice and wind that bit to the bone, a silent, brutal ally of the Red Army. For the soldiers of the German Eighth Army, trapped in the Korsun salient, the cold was just one more enemy, as present and lethal as the Soviet patrols that stalked the snow-covered forests. The snow fell without end, covering disabled tanks and the bodies of the fallen in a white, indifferent shroud. Corporal Hans Richter, of the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, pulled the collar of his greatcoat tighter. Hunger was a frozen knot in his stomach, a constant ache that not even the hot ersatz coffee could soothe. They had been on emergency rations for days, and now even those were gone. His world had shrunk to a perimeter of frozen trenches, the distant sound of artillery, and the gaunt faces of his comrades. The daily routine was a litany of misery. Guard duty was an exercise in endurance against sleep and frostbite. The wounded, housed in makeshift cellars, moaned in the gloom, their bandages stained with blood and mud. The doctor, a man with a gray face and empty eyes, worked with trembling hands, amputating limbs with a saw without enough anesthesia. The smell of gangrene and despair clung to the frozen air. On January 28th, the news spread through the trenches like a poison. It wasn't an official announcement, but a murmur that passed from man to man, a rumor born from the crackle of radios and the grim faces of the officers. The armored pincers of two entire Soviet fronts, Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian and Konev's 2nd, had met at the town of Zvenihorodka. The ring had closed. 56,000 men suddenly found themselves not on a battlefront, but in a cage of steel, snow, and mud. The first official communication sent to Field Marshal von Manstein's headquarters was laconic, almost pathetic in its simplicity. 3 words that changed everything. We are surrounded. For Hans, the news confirmed the fear that had been gnawing at his gut. He looked out across the endless white steppe. Out there, beyond his sight, hundreds of T-34 tanks and Soviet cannons were adjusting their aim. The outside world had vanished. All that remained was the pocket, the Kessel. And in the center of that Kessel, he and his comrades were the prize, prey awaiting the hunter's killing blow. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. The drone of U-52 transport engines was heavenly music to the trapped men. But time, that relentless general, sided with the Soviets. The snow turned to sleet and then to a freezing rain, heralding the beginning of the Rasputitsa. The rich black earth of Ukraine transformed into a sea of thick, clinging mud. The makeshift airfields inside the pocket became useless. The heavy transport planes bogged down, their wheels sinking into the mire up to the axles. Some managed to drop their supplies, but the wind carried the parachutes into enemy lines. Hope, which had arrived from the air, vanished into the gray, leaden sky. The encirclement was no longer just tactical. It was now total. The feeling of abandonment was as palpable as the cold that chilled their bones. To understand the trap, one must look at the map as the generals did in January 1944. What for Corporal Hans Richter was a hell of snow and mud. For the High Command was an abstraction of lines and arrows. And on that map, the German position west of the Dnieper formed a dangerous protuberance, a salient that jutted into the Soviet lines like a swollen, vulnerable thumb. It was a remnant of the previous autumn's battles, a balcony over the Dnieper that Hitler refused to abandon. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, a strategist of the old school and perhaps Germany's finest operational commander, saw it with chilling clarity. The Korsun salient was not a fortress, it was bait. Its flanks were dangerously exposed, its supply lines were tenuous, and it demanded too many men for its defense. Manstein had pleaded with the Führer's headquarters. Withdraw, shorten the line, consolidate forces to defend against the impending Soviet winter offensive. It was pure military logic, the painful but necessary decision to trade space for time and lives, a tactical withdrawal to prevent a strategic catastrophe. But hundreds of kilometers away, in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler saw a different map. He didn't see lines of vulnerability, but symbols of will and conquest. To him, ceding a single meter of Soviet soil won with German blood was heresy, a show of weakness he could not afford. His mind was anchored in past victories, in encirclements his armies had broken. He remembered Demyansk. He remembered the Kharkov counterattack. The word Kessel, cauldron, did not inspire the same terror in him as it did in his soldiers. In his delusional optimism, He believed any encirclement could be supplied by air and broken from the outside. The order was blunt, irrevocable: hold the position at all costs. The Korsun salient would be held. This strategic blindness was the Soviets' greatest ally. While paralysis and obedience to suicidal orders reigned on the German side, on the Soviet side, the war machine worked with lethal precision. The Korsun salient was not just an opportunity for the Stavka, the Soviet High Command. It was the perfect test to prove their new doctrine. The plan, approved by Stalin and orchestrated by his marshals, was of a brutal and elegant simplicity. Two entire fronts, Nikolai Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian from the north and Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian from the south, would strike the bases of the salient. They were not seeking a frontal assault, but a massive double envelopment, pincers of steel that would close behind the German divisions. Ivan Konev, the commander of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, personified this new Soviet confidence. He was a hard man, forged in the defeats of 1941 and now thirsty for revenge and glory. He was no armchair theorist. He was a master of the operational art, a specialist in encirclements who saw the battlefield as a predator sees its prey. For him, the Germans in the salient were not an army to be defeated, but a mass to be contained, crushed, and annihilated. His rivalry with Vatutin was legendary, a fierce competition that sometimes hindered coordination, but often spurred both to even greater feats. At Korsun, their common objective was clear: create a Stalingrad in miniature, to prove to the world, and to the Germans, that the catastrophe on the Volga had been no fluke. The Red Army of 1944 was no longer that of 1941. It had learned. It had suffered and bled. But above all, it had learned. They had mastered the art of maskirovka, military deception, concentrating enormous armored and artillery forces without the enemy realizing the scale of the coming blow. And so, as German soldiers froze at their posts, obeying the order of a leader disconnected from reality, the jaws of the Red Army prepared to close. The arrogance of the German High Command, their inability to see their enemy's evolution, was the decisive factor. The trap was not a fluke of combat. It was a work of military engineering, executed with overwhelming force. The fate of the 56,000 men was already sealed, not on the battlefields of Ukraine, but in the map rooms of Rastenburg and Moscow. The freezing wind carried not only snow, but words. Words carried on radio waves, amplified by loudspeakers mounted on Soviet trucks and hurled over the German lines like another form of bombardment. It was the ultimatum, a formal document, signed by Marshals Konev and Vatutin, addressed to General Stemmerman and all officers and soldiers trapped in the pocket. The message was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a blend of promises and threats calculated to break morale. It spoke of the futility of resistance. It offered an honorable deal: immediate surrender in exchange for safety, hot food, and medical treatment for the wounded. It guaranteed their lives and eventual return home after the war. But then came the alternative, described with terrifying coldness. Continued resistance would mean total annihilation. The ultimatum detailed the overwhelming Soviet superiority in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. It did not offer a battle, but an extermination. Every word was designed to paint a vivid picture of the hell that would be unleashed if the offer was rejected. In the makeshift headquarters of the 18th Army Corps, a tense silence filled the room as the message was translated. General Wilhelm Stemmermann, an old guard artillery officer, listened with an impassive face. His world had been reduced to an impossible choice. He was a professional soldier, loyal to his men, trapped between Hitler's delusional orders and the crushing logic of the Soviet ultimatum. Surrender was unthinkable, not only because of the Führer's order, but because of the honor code of a German officer and a genuine fear of Soviet captivity. The stories from Stalingrad were fresh in everyone's memory. To reject the ultimatum, however, was to sentence thousands of his men to certain death. Meanwhile, outside the pocket, the clash of wills reached a fever pitch. Manstein, furious at Hitler's indecision, frantically assembled every available tank. The 3rd Panzer Corps and the ex-Elfenbein Corps were torn from other sections of the front to form a relief force. The operation had a name filled with hope: Winter Storm. But the reality was a race against time, mud, and the growing strength of the Soviet ring. Inside the pocket, Stemmermann made his decision: It would not be a static defense. They would not stay to die in their trenches. He organized his forces into what became known as a wandering Kessel, a mobile defensive perimeter that slowly contracted, fighting for every meter of ground while preparing for the unthinkable. The final decision, the only one that offered a sliver of hope, crystallized in the desperate communications between Stemmermann and Manstein. They would not wait for a full rescue. The trapped troops would attempt a mass breakout to the southwest, towards the village of Lysyanka, to meet Manstein's armored vanguard. It was a desperate gamble, a charge through the heart of Konev's forces. The ultimatum was rejected. The German response was silence. A silence the Soviets correctly interpreted as defiance. For Ivan Konev, the refusal was no surprise. It was an invitation. Diplomacy was over. Now the artillery would speak. The annihilation he had promised was no longer a threat, but an operational objective. The destruction machine of the Second Ukrainian Front was ordered to prepare for the final assault. This is the moment when history pauses, holding its breath. 56,000 men, led by an honorable but doomed general, prepare to hurl themselves against a wall of steel. A relief force battles mud and a determined enemy a few kilometers away, and a relentless, methodical Soviet marshal prepares to close his fist. The battle about to be unleashed will not just be a clash of armies, but a primal struggle for survival in one of the war's most brutal settings. To understand how this hell unfolded, how every decision and every act of courage influenced the outcome, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because in the next part of this documentary, we will take you into the heart of Hell's Gate. On February 4th, hope had a name: 3 Panzer Corps, Manstein's relief force. The armored spearhead that was supposed to break the encirclement began its advance. On paper, it was a formidable force. Battalions of Panther and Tiger tanks. The elite of the Panzerwaffe, supported by mechanized infantry. But paper doesn't bleed or drown in mud. The Rasputitsa had arrived in full fury. The Ukrainian soil, normally frozen iron hard, had become a bottomless mire. The thick, cloying mud swallowed the tracks of the tanks. The mighty 45-ton Panthers and the monstrous 60-ton Tigers became immobile steel coffins, easy prey for Soviet anti-tank artillery. Every kilometer was a Pyrrhic victory, won at a terrible cost in fuel, materiel, and men. The advance was not measured in kilometers per day, but in meters per hour. Infantrymen had to walk ahead of the tanks, sometimes using planks to create a precarious path over the muck. The mud was not an obstacle. It was a predator, devouring Manstein's army. Konev had anticipated the relief attempt. He had woven a defense in depth, a web of anti-tank guns, minefields, and entrenched rifle divisions. He didn't need to defeat Manstein's force in a pitched battle. He just needed to slow it down, to bleed it, until time ran out for the men trapped in the pocket. Inside the Kessel, the days dragged on in mounting agony. By February 11th, the situation was critical. The pocket had shrunk to a tiny fraction of its original size. It was a hell of a few square kilometers, crammed with men, wounded horses, and destroyed vehicles. The sky belonged to the Soviets. Ilyushin Il-2 attack planes, the Sturmoviks, flew over the perimeter unopposed. Their cannons and rockets riddled anything that moved. The German soldiers called them the Black Death. Their appearance was the prelude to an artillery barrage that turned the lunar landscape into an even deeper inferno. Rations were gone. The men ate horses that died from enemy fire or starvation. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Gunners counted their shells one by one, firing only at certain targets. Fuel was more precious than gold. The few tanks still running moved as little as possible. The worst torture was the sound. In the distance, to the southwest, they could hear the dull echo of Manstein's guns. 10 kilometers. On a normal day, a 2-hour walk. Now, it was a distance more impassable than the ocean. Hope was so close they could hear it, yet it was completely unreachable. Konev was tightening his iron fist, and the pressure was unbearable. On the night of February 16th, the final decision was made. There would be no more waiting. Manstein was stalled. The rescue would not arrive. General Stemmermann gathered his commanders. The order was simple and brutal. Breakout. At 11 o'clock at night, in 3 columns, they would attempt to break the encirclement on foot. All heavy equipment was destroyed. Guns were disabled. Trucks set ablaze. Secret documents were burned in bonfires that cast a ghostly glow on the soldiers. Tense faces. The wounded who could not walk were left behind, with a medic, some rations, and a fatal dose of morphine for those who asked for it. It was one of the cruelest and most necessary decisions of the war. The three columns set off in the darkness, shrouded in a blizzard that offered both cover and disorientation. The first column, with the few remaining armored vehicles, formed the spearhead. Behind them, a mass of thousands of men, many unarmed, ground crew, cooks, clerks, all reduced to the status of desperate fugitives. Their objective was a narrow corridor near the village of Shandarovka, a valley that the survivors would forever christen Hell's Gate. Konev was waiting. His intelligence units had informed him of the impending breakout attempt. He had prepared a welcoming committee. On the hills overlooking the valley, T-34 tanks and anti-tank guns were dug in, their cannons aimed at the valley floor. Entire artillery batteries had pre-plotted coordinates. When the German vanguard entered the valley, the world exploded. Hundreds of guns opened fire simultaneously. High explosive and fragmentation shells rained down on the columns. The white snow was stained red and black. The few German tanks were destroyed in minutes, becoming torches that illuminated the carnage. The chaos was absolute. Discipline evaporated, replaced by the most primal survival instinct. The columns disintegrated into a mob of men running, screaming, and dying. Lieutenant Gerhardt, trying to hold the remnants of his company together, was torn in half by a tank shell. Private Klaus, who had lost his rifle in the mud, just ran, not looking back, stepping over the bodies of his fallen comrades. It was an open-air slaughterhouse. T-34 tanks descended from the hills, their machine guns scything through the helpless groups of men. Soviet infantry advanced, throwing grenades and firing at point-blank range. For the Germans, it was not a battle, it was a massacre. The last obstacle was the Gniloy Tikich River. It was not wide, but its waters were deep and icy, its banks steep and slick with mud. To cross it under fire was the final test. Some tried to swim, only to die of hypothermia or from the bullets splashing around them. Others tried to form human bridges, drowning under the weight of their comrades. On the opposite bank, Konev's tanks waited. They fired into the mass of men struggling in the water. An IS-2 tank, Stalin's new heavy monster, took up position and began to methodically shell the enemy bank, each blast taking dozens of men. The breakout had become a death trap within the larger trap. In the midst of this hell, General Stemmermann, true to his word, remained with the rear guard, trying to impose some order on the chaos, a beacon of duty in an ocean of terror. His fate, like that of thousands of his men, would be sealed at that frozen river. The dawn of February 17th revealed a nightmarish scene at Hell's Gate. The valley of Shandarovka and the banks of the Gniloy Tikich were an open-air cemetery. Thousands of bodies lay in the blood and mud-stained snow, frozen in the postures in which death had found them. The river carried bloated corpses, and its banks were strewn with abandoned equipment. Helmets, rifles, backpacks, and family photographs dropped in the mire. The breakout was neither a success nor a total failure. It was a human catastrophe with an ambiguous military outcome. Of the approximately 56,000 men trapped, about 30,000 managed to cross the river and reach Manstein's lines. But they were not an army. They were a horde of traumatized survivors, many of them wounded, most unarmed, all suffering from frostbite and extreme exhaustion. They arrived not as a fighting force, but as ghosts. Their appearance, with sunken eyes and tattered uniforms, was a devastating blow to the morale of the relief troops. They had fought and died to save their comrades, and what returned was the walking image of defeat. The real impact was the loss of materiel. 6 German divisions, including the elite 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, ceased to exist as effective formations. Hundreds of tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces were left behind, destroyed or captured. For a German army already suffering from a severe equipment shortage, it was a blow from which they would not recover. Manstein had lost a crucial part of his army group south, and a massive hole had been torn in his front. For the German command, news of the Korsun disaster spread like a shockwave. Goebbels' propaganda tried to spin it as a heroic retreat, a successful escape against all odds. But the generals at the front knew the truth. Faith in Hitler's strategic leadership, already weakened after Stalingrad, eroded further. The order to yield no ground had led directly to another catastrophe. The frustration at Manstein's headquarters was palpable. They had been so close, 10 kilometers. Blame and recriminations poisoned the atmosphere. Was it the mud, Soviet superiority, the slowness of decision-making? The truth was a combination of all of them. But the result was the same, a humiliating defeat. On the Soviet side, the feeling was one of triumph, though tinged by the high cost. Ivan Konev toured the battlefield, observing the scale of the destruction. He had fulfilled his promise of annihilation. Although thousands had escaped, the core of 2 German army corps had been destroyed. The field was sown with the black crosses of the Wehrmacht, a silent testament to his victory. The news of the liquidation of the Korsun pocket was broadcast across the Soviet Union. It was celebrated as a great victory, further proof that the Red Army was now the preeminent military force in the world. For Soviet soldiers all along the vast front line, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the news was a moral tonic. The Germans were not invincible. They could be surrounded, trapped, and destroyed. The deepest psychological impact, however, came from the spread of the famous quote that encapsulated the brutality and confidence of the Soviet command. When German radio, in its last desperate broadcasts from the pocket, cried out to the world that they were surrounded, the response attributed to Konev resonated with chilling finality. No, you are not surrounded. You are in a coffin. This sentence became the tombstone of German hopes in the East. On February 17th, the noise of battle finally ceased, replaced by a sepulchral silence broken only by the moans of the wounded and the sharp orders of Soviet officers. Organized resistance was over. German soldiers, in small groups or individually, emerged from the woods and ravines, hands raised, their faces a mask of frost, fatigue, and defeat. The final statistics painted a picture of near-total devastation. Some 18,000 German prisoners began the long march to POW camps in the east, a journey from which few would return. An estimated 20,000 more lives were lost in the fighting, drowned in the frozen river, or simply vanished in the chaos. The material booty was immense, a graveyard of tanks, guns, and vehicles that covered kilometers of the Ukrainian steppe. But the victory came at a horrific price. The Red Army suffered approximately 80,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, to close and liquidate the pocket. This staggering number is the most eloquent testament to the ferocity of the fighting, the desperation of the trapped Germans, and the Soviet determination to pay any price in blood to purge their land of the invader. In the long run, Korsun was much more than a simple victory. It was the confirmation that Stalingrad had been no fluke. It proved that the Red Army had achieved operational maturity, outclassing its German counterparts in the complex art of deep battle, encirclement, and annihilation. Stalin's generals had learned their lessons in the bitter defeats of 1941 and 1942, and now they applied those lessons with ruthless efficiency. For Germany, it was another hemorrhage in a war they could no longer win. The loss of 6 divisions, with all their heavy equipment, was a blow from which Army Group South would never fully recover. It drained precious armored reserves and solidified the Eastern Front's reputation as an insatiable meat grinder, a place where divisions went in and simply disappeared. The Battle of Korsun-Cherkasy became a legend, forging the reputations of its commanders. Ivan Konev was catapulted into the pantheon of great Soviet military heroes. His name became synonymous with the armored offensive and the war of encirclement, a marshal whose ambition and ruthlessness on the battlefield were matched only by his success. And on the other side, the tragic figure of General Wilhelm Stemmermann. His body was found days after the battle, near a destroyed tank where he had fallen fighting with his rearguard. In a final act of chivalrous respect, so rare in the brutality of the Eastern Front, the Soviets, impressed by his courage, buried him with full military honors. A grim end for an honorable soldier whose courage was squandered by the madness of his leaders, a symbol of the tragedy of an entire generation of German soldiers.